used to think people remembered conversations as a whole, that if you explained yourself clearly enough, it would all stick. But over time, I noticed something unsettling. People would remember how I started talking and how I ended. Everything in between felt invisible. Maybe you felt this too. You walk away from a conversation feeling like you shared a lot. But later, the other person recalls just one early moment and one final line. Not the effort, not the details, just the opening impression and the closing feeling. That's not forgetfulness. That's psychology. Your brain isn't designed to store everything evenly. It anchors memory at the edges. And once you see this pattern, you stop trying to be memorable all the time. You focus on the moments that actually matter. There's a well-documented memory pattern behind this. It's called the serial position effect. When your brain takes in a sequence of information, it doesn't store each part equally. The first items get more attention. They're processed with less mental clutter. That's the primacy effect. Early information is encoded more deeply into long-term memory. The last items are different. They're still active in working memory. That's the recency effect. What comes last is easiest to retrieve. Everything in the middle competes for limited resources. Cognitive load increases. Interference sets in. So recall drops. This isn't about intelligence or interest. It's about how memory naturally organizes experience. And once you understand this structure, a lot of confusing social moments start to make sense. I remember leaving a conversation feeling like I'd done everything right. I listened, I explained, I stayed engaged. It felt full, almost productive. But later, when it came up again, something felt off. The other person referenced the opening moment and the final exchange. Everything else had vanished, not because it wasn't meaningful to me, because it never anchored in their mind. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. Effort doesn't equal memorability. The brain doesn't reward consistency. It rewards contrast. And without realizing it, I had placed all my energy in the part people remember least. The brain pays extra attention at the beginning because nothing else is competing yet. Early information benefits from attentional priority. Working memory is still clear. This allows deeper encoding into long-term memory. Repetition isn't required. Clarity is. Research on memory encoding shows that first items are rehearsed more often internally, not consciously, automatically. They also shape the mental frame for what follows. This is known as schema formation. Once a frame is set, new information is filtered through it. That's why first impressions are so powerful. They don't just get remembered, they organize everything that comes after. There are people you met once, years ago. You don't remember the conversation, you don't remember what you talked about, but you remember how you felt in the first minute. Calm, guarded, seen. That early tone never fully left, even as time passed. Later interactions added information, but they didn't overwrite the frame. They just fit inside it. That's the quiet power of beginnings. They don't need to be dramatic. They just need to be clear. Once that opening feeling is set, the mind stops reevaluating from scratch. The end of an interaction works differently. It doesn't rely on deep encoding. It relies on availability. Information presented last is still active in working memory. There's been no time for decay, no interference yet. This makes the final moments easiest to recall. not because they're most important, but because they're most accessible. Psychologists call this retrieval proximity. What's closest to recall time wins. This is why conclusions matter more than explanations, and why last impressions often override middle ones. The brain isn't summarizing. It's grabbing what's still on the surface. I once gave a long presentation full of careful points. I left feeling proud of the details I'd covered. A colleague later told me, I mostly remember your opening story and the last thing you said about the next steps. Everything in between had disappeared. It hit me. People don't carry the middle with them. They carry the edges. The first moment that grabbed them and the last one that lingered. And if the edges aren't strong, the middle doesn't matter. The middle of any sequence suffers from interference. Earlier information competes with later information. Attention fades. Cognitive load rises. Memory researchers call this proactive and retroactive interference. Old items interfere with new ones. New items interfere with old ones. The result? Most of the middle gets lost. This isn't about forgetting because it's unimportant. It's about how our memory system prioritizes edges over the center. So, when you notice conversations or presentations being remembered only at the start and end, this is why. It's the brain's natural way of filtering. I once tried to cram every point into a single meeting. More examples, more explanations, more effort. I left thinking I'd nailed it. But later, the feedback told a different story. People only remembered the first anecdote I shared and the last line I said before leaving the room. All the middle details, the hours I spent explaining, vanished. It was a humbling lesson. More talking doesn't equal more memorability. The brain simply doesn't record everything equally. Understanding the serial position effect changes how you communicate. Leaders, teachers, and influencers don't need to overload people with details. They need to prioritize beginnings and endings. Primacy frames perception. Recency solidifies takeaways. This applies to sales pitches, presentations, dating, and even casual conversations. The middle? Optional. Useful, but not critical. By focusing on these edges, you shape what people actually remember, not just what you said. It's influence without manipulation, just awareness of how memory naturally works. I started experimenting with the edges, opening strong, closing clean, leaving the middle lighter. The change was subtle but noticeable. People started recalling exactly what I wanted them to remember. Not because I forced it, but because I respected how their memory worked. Conversations felt easier. I wasn't trying to fill space anymore. And strangely, I was more confident. Less effort, more impact. That's when I realized the brain rewards strategic simplicity, not quantity. The primacy effect isn't about tricks, it's about clarity and intention. When you lead with your strongest points, you help your listener encode the most important information. No gimmicks required. Psychologists call this ethical framing, structuring information to be memorable without coercion or deception. Opening with clarity sets a mental map. Your audience knows where to focus. They remember what matters most. It's simple, powerful, and human. And it works in conversations, presentations, and even emails. I once ended a meeting with almost nothing. No last-minute points, no extra clarifications. At first, it felt awkward, but later, people remembered the key message perfectly. The pause gave their brain space to anchor the final thought. That moment taught me something powerful. You don't always need to fill the end with words. Silence can highlight what truly matters. Sometimes less isn't just more. It's unforgettable. The brain doesn't just store the last thing, it amplifies emotion. Research in cognitive psychology shows that emotional events are more likely to be consolidated into memory. This is called affective tagging. When your final words or actions carry emotion, surprise, humor, warmth, they stick longer. Even if the content is simple, the emotional weight boosts recall. This is why endings matter more than middle details. It's not just what you say, it's how it feels in the moment. Recency plus emotion equals unforgettable impressions. I've realized something important. People don't remember everything you do. They carry the edges, the first impression you make, and the last feeling you leave behind. The middle? It fades into the background. Not because it's not important, but because the brain filters it out naturally. Once you accept this, you stop over-explaining. You stop trying to be remembered for every word. Instead, you focus on moments that actually anchor in memory. And suddenly, your conversations, presentations, and connections feel lighter and far more effective. Here's the simple mental model. First equals framing. Last equals meaning. Middle equals optional. Primacy sets the tone. It creates the lens through which everything else is seen. Recency locks in the takeaway. It ensures the final impression is remembered. The middle? It fills space, adds context, but rarely sticks. By designing your beginnings and endings intentionally, you work with memory, not against it. And that's the real power of the serial position effect. You don't need to be remembered for everything, just what truly matters.